See applied behavior analysis in a different and refreshing light here at the Skinner Report. Hosted by Sara Litvak and Anna Bullard, they shed light on what ABA therapy organizations need to know to level up their behavioral health services, helping every individual with autism meet their maximum potential. Join information-filled episodes with leading industry experts as they discuss every issue and update in the ABA scene, giving you an idea of what you can do to become a quality ABA organization and support the building of inclusive and comfortable workplaces in this side of the healthcare world. Here are your hosts, Sara and Anna.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Skinner Report. Today, we are going to be talking about BHCOE's most recent compensation report with Dr. David Cox, BHCOE's Chief Data Officer, and we are also going to be doing a conference rundown. All right, let's dive in. All right, we are going to do our quick conference rundown, all the conferences in ABA that are coming up very, very soon here. We have the Ohio ABA conference coming up February 11th through 12th in Columbus, Ohio. That is going to be virtual and in-person hybrid, I believe. I know everyone's scrambling a little bit. There's the ABAI Annual Autism Conference in Seattle, Washington, March 5th through 7th. That same weekend, we have the Cal-ABA Conference, March 4th through 6th, and then APBA in New Orleans, March 17th through 18th, and then Nebraska will be March 24th through 25th. Are you guys going to any of them? What are you thinking?
Oh yeah, I'll be at two of those for sure. So I'll be at Cal-ABA and APBA. So I think those are gonna be fun. Cal-ABA is always a good time.
Cal-ABA is great.
And I'll take the opportunity to promote data and analytics at BHC. We have a symposium there. Come check it out. It's gonna be fun.
Yeah, we have a presentation at APBA as well. And I believe Dr. Kazemi, our Chief Science Officer, is an invited presenter at the Ohio ABA conference, which I'm very excited about. I am just honestly, I'm praying for Cal-ABA and APBA because the last 2 years ago, they had to cancel their conference and go virtual. And I know everyone's hurting right now. So I'm just crossing my fingers that they can still have their conference and that it goes off without a hitch.
Yeah, I think that's, everybody's kind of holding their breath, right? But I just want to say if you are just strictly going on location, New Orleans sounds really great.
Yeah, you can't beat that.
Oh, absolutely not.
So that sounds fun. But Cal-ABA, I'm super excited about that. I think that's going to be a great event. And there's a lot of great things going on in California right now. With just some of the advocacy being done and things like that. So I think it's going to be a great year of exciting things happening.
Yeah. Oh, you know what? I forgot the Behavior Analyst Leadership Conference is coming up too. And that's the same weekend as Cal-ABA and as ABAI Autism. So we have 3 competing conferences, BALC, ABAI, and Cal-ABA the same weekend. So if you're going to any of them, let us know. We can't wait to hear how they are. Welcome to episode 2 of the Skinner Report. Today, we are going to be talking about BHCOE's most recent compensation report with Dr. David Cox himself, BHCOE's Chief Data Officer. Welcome, David.
Hey, how you guys doing?
We're good. And Anna's here too. Yay, Anna.
Hi, everybody. So glad to be back. Welcome, David.
I don't know about you guys. We just got out of this amazing leadership meeting and my serotonin is really I'm feeling good. I'm feeling bonded and connected.
Yeah. Right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, Sarah, that's what I was just thinking. I mean, what a great day. It's so fun working with people that you like, right? I mean, I'm like, wow, everybody's just so connected. It's really fun. But yeah, great day.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, and there's just so much fun and cool stuff going on across the departments. And yeah, I'm really excited. 2022, I think, is going to be a pretty big year.
It's going to be a good year. I agree. All right, David, we got to ask you, tell us about your love of data. How did you become the Chief Data Officer at BHCOE?
Yeah, good question. So I guess I really started getting interested in data when I was a kid, just fascination with life on Earth. And that kind of led me naturally into the hard sciences. I'm like, how did this all come to be here? Behavior, how does that all work out? And in the hard sciences, obviously, data is critical to saying that you know anything that you're talking about. So that's kind of got into science data generally. But for big data, that love really came about when I pivoted away from ABA for individuals with autism spectrum disorders and developmental disabilities toward like pro-health behaviors, diet, physical activity, substance abuse. And in that camp, you don't get 30, 40 hours a week. You maybe get like 15 minutes every 2 weeks to do something. And so you have to get creative if you're approaching it from an operant perspective, and how you're going to collect data on those environment behavior relations. And technology is one way you can do that. But then that comes with the challenges of, all right, you have this tech collecting all this data. How do you actually handle that, process it, get it into a single format across the different technologies to analyze? So then I found, big data techniques allow you to do that. Started to get really interested in there. Then artificial intelligence, machine learning has a lot of promise and opportunity. Got fascinated with that. And then I think we were on a random panel together, I think Sarah on ethics or something, and started talking about what was going on. And yeah, this opportunity existed and was perfectly aligned with my interests. So
yeah, I think you were at Blue Cross Blue Shield, right? When you joined
I
our
was.
team. So you got to see the other side. The other side.
I did. Yeah, it was very interesting. 6 months of peeking behind the curtain.
It's so interesting, David. So what would you say is the hardest thing about working with data, right? I mean, for all of us out there who don't live and breathe in that world every day.
Yeah, I think there are kind of two things that come to mind with that question. The first is this idea of data distributions. So many listeners are probably familiar with like the bell curve, right? Normal distribution, and using like the average score as like one number to describe that whole distribution. But it turns out that there are like 30, 40 distributions that exist in the wild. And so when we talk about one data point or one number that's going to describe a large data set, you really have to understand the distribution behind those data. And then also when you start running analytics, and I want to say, this variable has this effect on some outcome, unless you're playing around with the distributions appropriately, those analytics can be off, and you may be thinking that you've observed something that you actually haven't. So that's kind of the first one. And then the second one, you guys maybe have heard me talk about this enough, it's not familiar, but just human variability and problem definition, right? So when you even set up a case with a kid that you're trying to measure some, toothbrushing or whatever, it can be challenging to get like 2 BTs in the BCBA all collecting data the same way. And then when you think about some of the stuff we're doing, or you scale to big data where you have tens of thousands of people all thinking about the same thing in slightly different ways and collecting data slightly differently, on the back end, taking those different data definitions and trying to make something of it is challenging. It's a lot of work.
I'm sitting here laughing because I'm like, yes, we are very familiar with that problem here at BHCOE. So maybe absolutely. Just for those of us who kind of are just toe dipping into the world of data collection, I guess talk to us a little bit about like the big picture. So what role does data play in our field? What role does it play in any field? And I guess on the broader in the broader world, I mean, we're here talking about standards and standardization and kind of benchmarking. Like, why is it important to collect large amounts of data? And particularly for our field, what's so important about standardizing the way we collect that data too, or those data? I know data are supposed to be plural, right?
Yeah, it's plural. Yeah. The number of reviewer comments I've got from that. So I'm biased. I love data. But I do firmly believe in Clive Humby's quote that data is the new oil. I think just generally the ease and efficiency and cost at which we can collect data has made it central to many different business and operational processes. And I think we've kind of moved away historically from this idea of behaving from intuition. We now have data to support and guide the decisions that we make from a business standpoint. And then from like a clinical perspective, I think data is also central to really understanding and reflecting on how well you're doing at something, consistent metrics and then comparing to some kind of benchmark. And so as a field for ABA, as a clinician, I can't know how well I'm doing unless I can compare my data to something else, to some other or another set of providers. And kind of like we talked about before, unless we're all talking about data and collecting it the same way, that comparison becomes almost impossible. That's where standardization comes in. If we're going to really reflect on who we are and how well we're doing, you have to have standardized data collection of some sort to make those comparisons.
It's really interesting, David. And Sarah, before we dive into more of the details of the report we're going to discuss. I mean, I think one thing I would, just like to ask both of you, because I would say as someone newer to BHCOE, I've been here a year, but what data, how does BHCOE decide what data that we collect? And then, Sarah, I think for, organizations out there who might be interested in becoming accredited, I'm thinking they would be, they would want to know, how do we keep that data secure? And, and how do we make sure, that all the things that we're putting together, that what it's being used for, right? And so I'm just kind of asking both of you in that world, as someone who's talked to a lot of provider organizations, what that looks like.
Happy David's like, you go.
Yeah, do you want to jump in? Yeah.
So I guess I'll just start a little bit big picture, is that, ultimately when we collect data, it typically has some sort of function to it. So all the data that we typically collect are related to being able to make a educated and then legally defensible decision about an accreditation. So essentially, we have to be able to showcase that we have all the information we need to be able to showcase that an organization is in fact quality. And we need to be able to stand behind that if we get audited or if there's any type of legal issue that might arise with that organization. So typically those data elements that we collect are for that purpose. Now, that's kind of the first bucket, is the information that we just have to be able to make an accreditation decision. Then there's a second bucket related to benchmarking, and David kind of talked a little bit about that. And the requests that we've seen come in through providers that we worked with over the years is that most industries have some type of repository of a larger data set that they can benchmark against. And our industry, because it's so new, really lacks that data set. And so we really took it upon ourselves to really understand what are those KPIs and metrics that organizations need to be intelligent about their business, maintain competitiveness within the marketplace as well, really understand, are they hitting the mark or not? And then also just be able to continuously improve what they're doing. So there's kind of the second bucket that we use that's really related to benchmarking and business intelligence that allows organizations to make better decisions about trends in the market. And that's a little bit about what we're going to talk about today. And then the third bucket, which I'm sure we'll have an episode on in the future, is kind of the future of ABA and the future of care. And those are things related to things like value-based care or related to outcomes research and measurement. And so some of the components that we do measure allow us to be innovative and allow us to really be forward thinking in what we're collecting and then how we're informing accreditation decisions, because ultimately we want that first bucket I talked about to be useful, and we want it to evolve as the industry evolves. So those are kind of the three ways in which we collect data, or why we collect them. I don't know, David, if you have anything else to add on those.
Yeah, no, I think you nailed it, and you've been doing it obviously longer than I have, so I think you covered it well. I guess the only other thing I'd add is that when we think of like a standard and how we're going to collect those data, there is a standard process where we consult subject matter experts, we throw things out to the field and get feedback, we review the peer-reviewed literature, and all that kind of gets compressed into options. And then it's the question of, realistically, what can we practically ask organizations to provide without being too burdensome? And that kind of goes down to that final decision of this is the thing that we'll look for data on.
Yeah.
And what about the security on that, for organizations that may be like, how are you keeping my, this information secure that I'm sending you?
Yeah. Fortunately, compared to designing a standard, I think that's one of the easier parts. So the nice thing is that there's a lot of laws, regulations, best practice standards for the technological infrastructure for how data can and should be transferred, how it needs to be stored and protected behind paywalls and multi-factor authentication, things like that. And that technology and stuff exists. And so we've, followed best practice standards in that regard. Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah. And I'll just add, cybersecurity, you can't run a sophisticated organization today without thinking about cybersecurity. Security risks are at an all-time high right now, especially considering how virtual we've all gone. So it's something that any sophisticated organization has to have at the back of their mind at all times, especially when you're collecting data. So it's part of our general governance as well. And, we're consistently monitoring security threats that arise, and, we're regularly reporting internally and externally kind of any risks that we have on the cybersecurity side, and, any possible negative scenarios or actions we're taking in the last 90 days, plans for the next 90 days. So it's a core function that we have internally to monitor this and make sure that we're meeting best standards standards.
Now, I'll also throw out there for any listeners that are really into machine learning and big data analytics, the cybersecurity realm is really fun right now because, as you can imagine, as security measures get put in place, bad actors figure out ways to get around that. So you have kind of this game theory system going on. And yeah, a lot of fun modeling going on there.
Wow, that sounds great. I mean, I know organizations will that certainly is something that is important. So great answers. It's awesome. Sarah, I think we want to dive into the report.
Yeah, I think, the piece I'll caveat this with before I ask Dave, we kind of machine gun asked David a ton of questions about it, is I wanted to just kind of share a little bit about the need that we saw in the field that drove the report. And I think if you've been working with us over the last 5-6 years, or if you've kind of consumed any of our information, we typically would report on compensation and turnover as a kind of like a page in our annual report, and you'd have to dig a couple pages in to try and find it. And we noticed that people were really referencing that broader document just for that information. So this is actually the first year we've released it as a standalone. And the goal is really to continuously refresh it so that it's available to our members pretty consistently. So I guess I'll just start with David. What did we find? Tell us about first of all, what can you find in the report? What is something that you think is essential that people should know if they're in the report? What are they going to find there?
Yeah, so generally within the report, there are kind of the two halves to it. One is the general compensation for direct care staff and for supervisory staff. And we've broken that out by a variety of, or 5 different regions that are ranked based on their cost of living index. So, 50 states, I guess, and, a territory, break those into 5 groups of 10. And then within that, we then report where's that here? Average salary, median salary, minimum, maximum, and then the total sample size. And when I say salary, that's for the supervisors directly. For direct staff, we report the hourly rate. But that's kind of the big thing for compensation. And then similarly for turnover, we go through and we look at some different trends in turnover for direct care staff by year, 2016 through 2020. We also look at turnover by type. So was it like a disciplinary termination? Did they leave voluntarily? What impact did COVID had? Because that was fun. And then we do that same thing for supervisory staff. So that's kind of the general content. And I think, I think there's some interesting trends generally that we observed in the data over time in terms of increases in overall compensation, increases in turnover. I think one big thing that's challenging with this data set is COVID. So I think we get 2-3 years from now, we'll know 2020, what role did that really play in this data set? And, are the trends that we're observing here, are they real? Are they not real? What does that look like? So that's a high level overview.
So I think one of the biggest things I hear right now is that many providers see high compensation and quality as a trade-off. So they're kind of looking at it as if you pay too much, that you must be providing bad service or a bad work environment. And if you pay less, you're providing a better work environment. And I guess, I know you're a data guy, but just looking at everything that you see here, do you think there's a trade-off? And what do you think is the relationship between pay and quality?
Yeah, I think it's a complicated relationship. That's my short answer. But it kind of reminds me of the nonprofit discussion. For-profit versus nonprofit. I think you could be a phenomenal organization that pays well and you have high quality. Similarly, you could pay well and have poor quality, and vice versa. Maybe you don't pay well and you have high quality, or you don't pay well and you have poor quality. And that's mainly, I think there's just so many things that go into running a successful clinic and business that are going to impact how well I can pay my employees or not pay my employees. I think it's a really complicated question and much bigger than any kind of assumption in that capacity. But I don't know, it's my perspective.
So David, do you think this report can definitively answer the question, does pay rate contribute to turnover, and to what percentage, or do you feel like it is a large contributor? I mean, from what you've seen, if somebody just asked that question, that simple question from this report, what would you answer?
Yeah, so I would say the data in this report can't answer that question. What I can say is we played around last year, I guess almost a year ago at this point, We ran a benchmark report specifically on turnover, where we looked at some more advanced analytics, and with all the data that we had at BHC, could we try to predict turnover? And if we can, what variables seemed important? And I think the general trend from that, and then the literature on turnover, is we know that satisfaction relates to turnover, and we know that pay rate is one component of staff satisfaction that influences overall scores there, but it's certainly not the whole story. And when we ran that kind of predictive analytics turnover benchmark report, staff compensation or employee satisfaction with compensation was toward the top of the variables that were important, but it wasn't the most important. We actually found employee satisfaction with career development was the most important predictor. So it's, again, I think a complicated and more nuanced relationship than exists. And there are a lot of ways people can be compensated or gain benefit from their job that's not just how their hourly rate or their salary.
That makes a lot of sense. As I'm looking at this report, I'm just on page 6. If you do have, if you're following along while you're listening, I'm on page 6, and there's like this beautiful map of the United States, and it has all the 5 different, cost of living color coded states in there. And you see this range of, the highest or the lowest cost of living, which is about $18 an hour pay rate for direct care staff. And then on the higher end, you have about like $21 an hour. But then when you go on the next page, you kind of have all these columns where it talks about not just the average, but it talks about things like the median hourly or the average minimum or average maximum. Can you talk to us a little bit about what do we do with information like the median or the average min or the average max? Like why did you include those in this report?
Oh yeah, great question. This was my way to try to sneak in distributions, I guess. So those data are really there to provide context. An average hourly rate is interesting in and of itself, but what's not shown here is, is that distribution really fat? Are we seeing a lot of variability? Is it very narrow, right? And we see very low variability. And with just the one data point in the average, you can't really see that. So adding in the median, right? Compare that to the average. If they're relatively similar, that lets you know it might be a normal distribution or it's probably close. And then the min and the max, again, try to give the reader some kind of range of the variability that we're seeing in our data set. I will say, if I were to do this again, I think I'd maybe add in a visual, like a histogram or something, or add in standard deviation or something else to give, I think, a bigger picture on that variability. That's what they're there for, though.
Yeah, I was going to laugh because there's an element in this report that I will go on the record saying that David did suggest that we include a standard deviation in this report. And I was like, people aren't going to know what that means. And then, of course, people are asking what the standard deviation is. So I will go on record by saying that if you're mad that there's no standard deviation, you can send your hate mail to the office and I will receive it gladly. But when we're looking at like the supervisors, for example, and you have that range of like, 70K, for example, all the way up to 87. And then, I'm going to the highest cost of living index and I can see like the max average is $150,000 on average. Like, what do we do with that? Like when people see that and they get nervous that, oh no, my staff are going to ask me to pay them that. What would you say to someone whose supervisor brought them this and said, this is how much I should get paid, or this is, I'm not being compensated appropriately?
Good point, Sarah.
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think if someone were to bring that, well, in the nicest way possible, I'd say, remember that that's also the max, right? So these are people that have probably been in the field 10, 15 years. This also, there's some people that get compensated in various ways that, 150 at one agency doesn't mean the same thing as a 150 in another agency. So when I report, for example, that I'm paying somebody $80,000, maybe I did or maybe I didn't include other things. Like if you bill more than 25 hours, you can make extra money or things like that. So kind of going back to those data definitions, kind of pointing out again, this is all context, right? That's an average max. Who knows how long those people have been in the field? Who knows the true reimbursement or compensation structure at that organization? And I would direct them back to the average and the median, right? Where are most people are falling around in terms of what they're compensated? And then again, I think this, not to belabor the point, this is where also the standard deviation also I think is helpful, because the min and the max are informative, but what you don't know is how much of an outlier were those effectively, right? Is the most of the distribution really centered around the 80 to 90, 85 to 95? Is it really spread out and they're, 150 and then a 145 was next on the list or something like that? You kind of lose that without the visual.
Can we nerd out for like one more minute where we talk about
Of course.
Windsorizing and the Tukey method? Okay, so we did get some questions about this. That's kind of why I'm posing this to David. And so we decided to run a couple other analyses on this data set because we were trying to understand, okay, let's just say that was one provider that pays that big amount, what would happen if we looked, pulled that data set out. So do you want to talk to us a little bit about Windsorizing and the Tukey method and what the results, if I remember, were not that significant when we did pull the averages out, but the max averages. So just tell us what you did and then what our finding was generally.
Oh yeah, sure. So there, with Windsorizing and like Tukey's method, the idea there is how can we control for outliers in our data set? And so those can be defined in a number of ways, right? Those really high or really low numbers, they're going to impact, especially the average where that falls. The Windsorizing your data set is effectively where you take all extreme values or everything, depending on how you do it, beyond like the 5th and the 95th percentile, and you reassign those values to the numbers that are at the 5th and the 95th percentile. The advantage there is you get to keep all the data that's in your data set. The downside is that you start placing extra weight on those edges of your distribution at those specific percentiles. An alternative method that I tend to prefer, it's called Tukey's method. And this is basically, you take the 25th percentile and the 75th percentile, the difference between those, multiply that by 1.5. And essentially anything that falls above the 75th percentile on that number or below the 25th percentile on that number, you just drop those from your data set. And I like that method because it's non-parametric. You don't have to necessarily worry about the distribution of your data, though it can influence that. But in any event, two methods for handling those extreme values that may influence your average in particular. So we played around a couple different methods. At the end of the day, the numbers really didn't change much. Which I think gave me confidence in particular with the numbers that we put into the report. And then also those questions, again, it's good feedback to figure out how we might do this differently for the one that we'll release later this year.
David, how much do you think reimbursement rates within a specific region and I would say state contribute to this, right? Because I can just hear a provider in my head right now saying, well, of course I can't pay those rates because my primary business is in a state which has one of the lowest reimbursement rates. So kind of how would you talk about how that plays into this report, if it does? Like
the location in the country and.
Yeah, right. Because I mean, I think that's for providers, a lot of, especially if you're operating in one state, right? And that state in particular has low reimbursement rates.
I was just going to comment on something. I'm sure you have thoughts too, but I'm just going to point you to the cost of living difference. So in group 5, the cost of living difference, there's a cost of living index score there. And so in group 5, for example, when you look at the difference between Rhode Island, which is 119 to Hawaii, it's 192. So that range is very wide. So you do have to be a little cautious in your interpretation that when you're looking at the whole, if you're in Rhode Island and you're grouped in group 5, you might be at the very much lower end. That's why that standard deviation that David was talking about is important, and that max and min as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes total sense.
And piggybacking off that, I think that's probably where I direct most readers. If you're in a specific state or one state in particular, or even across states, which one of those buckets do you happen to fall in? And then kind of, again, thinking about the average and those median salaries relative to the cost of living index within that, and kind of exactly like Sarah was saying.
Yeah, I think it's obviously something that's probably affects some people more than others, right? Just kind of depends.
Absolutely. And I think to that point too, and like some of the questions that were brought up earlier, thinking also about the function of pay within an organization, and if there are other benefits that you can offer. So there are economic constraints on what I can pay somebody. But, plug for BHCOE. You can also give opportunities for professional development and things like that. Or there are alternative ways to make the work environment more reinforcing. And that's not, that's also hard to do, but.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Speaking of, retention, I think, we could dive into the whole, issue with turnover right now. I'm hearing from so many providers, right? It's a really difficult environment. And I think that there've been a lot of contributing factors, but I'd love to get, both of your opinions, kind of on what you're also hearing. I'm just hearing that, we are seeing it be a real inhibitor to being able to take, more kids, access to care, those kinds of things.
Yeah. I mean, I couldn't agree more. I think what's interesting when you look at the numbers here is when we look at turnover for direct care staff, it's kind of steadily increasing, but I would say not in a way that's too surprising. So like when you look at the 2016 data set, and there was, a sample of around 5,000 clinicians included there, turnover was about 50%. When you're looking at 2020, 4 years later, you have around 6,000 folks in the sample, and it's around 59%. So it is going up. And what was interesting to me is that, when we think about turnover by type, I remember like during COVID, I was thinking these poor technicians are probably, really getting the grunt of all of it. Right. And I was thinking there would be a lot of COVID related terminations for the technicians and furloughs. And what was really surprising to me when looking at our data set is that the clinical directors actually took on the brunt of all the distress during COVID. So when you look at terminations, about 49% of the terminations that happened at the clinical director level were because of COVID related reasons in 2020. Whereas in, when you look at supervisors or direct care staff, it was 6% or 2% or 14% or something like that. So I think that was really interesting to me, is like the clinical directors, who I thought were really like holding up the organization, were really the ones that got cut first when you had this huge crisis. And those are oftentimes your more senior staff.
Yeah. Very interesting.
Yeah, it's a really good call out. And also thinking about too, like the direct care staff 2020, the 59%. If you drop that one from the analysis also, and then you look just across the 4 years prior, it's like 50, 52, 48, 53. Seems like it's pretty steady. And that's also comparable turnover percentages to other kind of similar related industries. So I am excited for the 2021 report that we'll put out and see, does that 59% hold? Do we continue to see an increasing trend? Is it back down to the 50%, somewhere in between?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think the other piece that's really interesting to me as well is, in most organizations, you're really trying to, it's an interesting, like you're always dealing with supply demand, and usually, there's always enough product, and it's just about getting them to the customers. Right. And so here it's kind of flipped, where you have customers, but not enough, product. But in this case, obviously it's people. So it's a very unique dynamic to look at within an industry. And I think ultimately it will level out, but I think that this is something that if we can crack as a field, we'll be so much more successful for it, and our patients will benefit so much from it.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think it's, I think there's a lot of factors that are very interesting with the RBT level of turnover, because it is an entry level position. And so in many cases, I think it's, really trying to figure out, separating out those that you can really career path. And then, and also that those that are just in it for a job and they're going to move on to another job. And I think it's an important piece that organizations are really reflecting on, because I do think, back to the beginning of our conversation, it's not always about how much you pay someone. What a lot of people value is the opportunity in the company, and where they can go, and that their leadership and the meaningfulness that they can contribute. So I think a lot of it too is figuring out that person to hire, which we just did an incredible leadership.
Assessment.
What was it called?
Assessment.
Assessment.
The
Thank you.
predictive
Assessment.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that was really, really interesting, right? I mean, in making sure you're hiring the right person.
I was going to say, yeah, for those listening. So we just started using the predictive index, which is a really interesting tool for kind of predicting whether a person's a good fit at the organization and helping people work together. But go ahead, Anna. I just wanted context.
Yeah, I just think that's a huge piece to this puzzle, right? Knowing that you're hiring the right person for the job is critical, because I've been in so many clinics, and myself, my own child having an RBT, work with her. It's not an easy job. It's not.
Yeah. And, I was going to say, like, I feel like this field isn't for everyone, and every organization isn't for everyone. So when I look at that turnover too, I go, okay, how much of that is just because that person wasn't a good fit for your organization? And how much of that is because you need to fix something within your organization? So I also look at, typically you look at like a sales pipeline or like a customer pipeline, but you need to look at your hiring pipeline and kind of figure out what can we adjust for at the top of the funnel to make sure that the right people are entering the funnel to begin with.
Such a good point, Sarah. So true.
And related to that, I mean, Sarah and you and I are both sitting here. We used to be clinicians, and at some point in time, some people just find different callings or different paths or different areas in the industry, and that's also okay. We're just kind of getting this idea that I think you're referencing, that not all turnover is bad turnover. And so as a field, if we're collecting these data, we're contributing it to a large database. We're also giving data on other variables. We'll start to really get a sense of what is a good turn rate, whatever that means. And what are the variables that contribute to the challenging turnover versus the turnover that's okay to live with?
Yeah, I was just saying, so David, like, looking at, I love that statement, like not all turnover is bad turnover. And, this data set is so informative. I guess, what advice do you have for ABA business owners or leaders who are thinking about how to utilize these turnover data sets, and, how can they integrate it into their regular business operations?
Oh yeah, good question. So I think the biggest way I think organizations could start integrating these data would be to collect data with similar definitions. So going back to this idea of defining a problem statement clearly in a way that allows me to compare myself to others. People could collect turnover and define it however they want, but at the end of the day, if that definition differs from everyone else's, it'll be hard to know what to do with their own data. So one way I think you can use this report is to really look and see, what are the types of turnover that people seem to be talking about? How are people classifying or bucketing their turnover? And then internally, start analyzing processes, collecting data. What are some variables in my company that might contribute to those larger buckets that people are reporting on in the industry?
I love it. Anna, what about you? I mean, you used to be in an operating role. What would you do with this data? Now I'm going to get tripped up. This data, these data. David, how do you keep it straight? I need a tool.
Many years.
Data.
Data. Yeah. What's your vote, David? Is it data or data?
Data.
Anna?
Absolutely.
I say data more, but I prefer data. And I don't know why I say data. It's actually
the Southern accent.
I think so.
Exactly.
Yeah. It's I'm with David though. I'm going to retrain my behavior to say data.
I say data. I say data.
Maybe it's an East Coast, West Coast thing. Yeah.
It must be. Yeah. This is what it's all about. No, I think it's such a great report. I think these types of things are so needed for our industry. They can be so helpful in really creating a long-term sustainable business that can really make an impact for kids with autism, right? Which is what we're all here for. So I love that we're doing it. And I also love that we are constantly evaluating how we can do it better. David's already like the next report, talking about the next report and how it's going to be even better.
Yeah.
And I love that.
Yeah, I agree. David, all right. What's the best data set you've ever worked with?
Oh yeah, I love this question. Because best can be defined in a few ways. So I'm going to take liberty to talk about, I think, four data sets. So one is just like the coolest, the one that sounds the coolest. And that was, we used we conducted some quantitative analyses of people's verbal reports of their psychedelic experiences. That was just a lot of fun. We used it to predict
what kind of
success and things.
What kind of psychedelics are we talking about?
So it was up to them. So they reported on their whatever psychedelic experience they had that led to changes in substance abuse in particular. And then they described the event as it unfolded.
Was that really in your postdoc? Where was that data set from?
Yeah, that was Johns Hopkins. That was really fun.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, really neat. There's we have one publication out on that, and I think a second one coming. If people are curious. The other one that I think is really fun with Jake Sozine, who's a data analyst at BHCOE, we downloaded every published behavior analytic article, and we have one manuscript under submission. We have 2 more coming down the pipeline, but we just analyzed it for trends. What are people talking about? What's the difference between the experimental and applied branch? Kind of what does that look like? That one's fun.
Very interesting.
Oh yeah, that one. Yeah, there's a lot of really neat stuff going on that. My third kind of favorite data set from interest is I have 10 years of every pitch thrown in professional baseball. And so we're analyzing for, patterns of choice, what leading to different decision making. What does that look like? How's the matching law fit in? That one's cool.
Of course, you do, David.
Yeah, I was about to say, I knew baseball was going to make its way into this conversation. Like, I should have thrown a bet out to Sarah, but I mean, I was like 100% sure.
I try to work it in. And I guess people that may have not attended previous presentations of mine, I always work baseball into all my slides too. So pre-presentation is one allusion to it if people are curious. But I think in terms of those are fun for different reasons, but the best all around data set, I think is really the one that we've started to build and are improving on here at BHCOE. I think there's a lot of really cool data on the industry that's going to allow us to ask and answer questions that nobody's asked before. And to me, that's really exciting. And I think it'll have, a big impact on the field. But
I was starting to feel a little left out that you weren't saying the BHCOE data set.
Save the best for last. That's right. Absolutely.
He was saving the best for last.
I know.
Just saving the best for last.
It is a beast, though. You have to admit, it's a beast.
Oh, it is. Yeah. And they're just, so many, it's what we've talked about before, distributions and how people define data differently. And it's presented so many fun challenges to figuring out what's there, what can we do with it. It's fun. I like it.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, David. This was very informative. Always so fun chatting with you on and offline. Anna and I are so lucky to work together. We have a great team, and we can't wait to have you back when our next benchmark report comes out.
Oh yeah. Appreciate you guys having me on. This is a fun podcast. Thanks for having me.
David, where can people find you on social?
Yeah, good question. So Twitter, I kind of post there, I think a decent amount. ResearchGate is where I have all of my research, a lot of publications, articles there. And then LinkedIn, I'm also somewhat active on. People can find me there.
Awesome. All right. And if you have any questions for us about this or anything else we talk about, or if you have any topic ideas, feel free to email us at TSR, which stands for the Skinner Report, at bhcoe.org. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
That's it for today's episode of The Skinner Report. By allowing yourself to be inspired and educated through this podcast, you are now one step closer to growing, building, or starting your own ABA practice that can impact the behavioral landscape. Continue nourishing your heart and mind right here by listening to more of our episodes at bhcoe.org. Be sure to subscribe to the show and leave a positive rating. Let us make the ABA scene safer, more caring, and more connected than ever before. Thank you for joining us. See you on the next one.